Our first speaker today was a member of the Connecticut House of Representatives down in New Haven from 2009 to 2014. He, at that time, served as the Deputy Majority Leader in his tenure as a state representative. He assumed the office of Connecticut State Senate for the 10th District in New Haven on February 28, 2014, so happy 10-year anniversary, 3 days from now. Gary Winfield was the driving force behind a bill which put in place protections for transgender citizens in public accommodations. He was the force behind the first statewide passage of the Trust Act, the first such bill in the country. He was the author of several police accountability bills, the first in the nation racial and ethnic impact statement on demand without restrictions, and prosecutorial transparency bills, along with several other progressive wins. He is the first non-attorney to serve as the co-chair of the state's Judiciary Committee. And much to my heart, I'm going to mention, I already mentioned my sin of burgers, but I'm going to also mention that Gary Winfield, along with another state rep, proposed a bill which would declare pizza to be the official state food of Connecticut. Thank you for that as well. Please welcome back to Justice Southbury, State Senator Gary Winfield.
Sometimes the pizza bill is the one that everybody pays attention to. Crazy. If you've ever seen me speak before, you know one thing about what's about to happen. You and I are both going to discover what I have to say as I say it. But I know where I'm starting this time, because when I was listening just now about Patrick Henry, I know a lot of the time when people today talk about Black history, we get into the era of slavery, and people will accuse us of the sin of presentism. And think about what Patrick Henry said. Patrick Henry was in that era, and he knew that slavery was wrong. There were a lot of people in that era who knew that slavery was wrong. And if none of them knew that slavery was wrong, the slaves knew that slavery was wrong. So when we speak about it, there's nothing wrong with looking critically at those moments. But I don't want to focus that much on slavery. The original question, I think, was about, do we need to keep teaching Black history, and is Black history important? And I want to start off with a affirmative yes, Black history is important, and we need to keep teaching it. As a matter of fact, I think more than we need to keep teaching it, we need to actually teach it. And so I want to go back to one of your speakers from a couple of weeks ago. I actually watch you guys, by the way. One of your speakers from a couple of weeks ago who brought up Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan talking about Black history is the proving ground for American ideals. And the reason I want to go back there is because when I was listening to her, I thought everything she was saying was true, but I think there was something that was missing from what was being said. Because when Ronald Reagan was speaking, he was using that to say something. There's a context there. And I think the context is why teaching Black history is important. Because I don't think you can understand this country without understanding the history of the Black folks in the country. And when Ronald Reagan was talking about the proving ground, what he did was he said, you know, we had this problem, but at the point of the decision, we did the right thing. Right? That's what Ronald Reagan was actually saying. That's not what she meant. And so the context of whatever we're talking about is critical. And the context in this country cannot be understood without understanding the place and the history of the Black people within this country. And so when you talk about the founding fathers, whether you're talking about George Washington, who chased down slaves forever, there's a really good book. They were her property that you should read about George Washington and the slaves. Whether you talk about Thomas Jefferson, who married his wife and then had a relationship with her sister, which most of us don't know that was her sister, who was a child, so that was a rape, right? Whether you talk about any of these founding fathers, what you realize is from the inception of this country, we did not value Black people, their bodies, and their work. And so when you hear that the Black child is worth half, it makes perfect sense in this country, right? It makes perfect sense, except if you don't understand the history, you question, why is that? And so that's a reason to teach Black history. when you hear that black people in this country, when they had the opportunity, progressed. And yet somehow that progress was ceded. And it wasn't just ceded because they stopped caring about progressing and they didn't want to be in the legislatures anymore. They didn't want to build up a society where they were doing what they were supposed to do, because there was terrorism enacted upon those people. And that terrorism became part of policy, right? And so we created policy so that we didn't have to do the things we had to do, where early on in flight, this is the craziest thing to me when you think about it. We had just learned how to put people into the air, and we airbound black communities right after we learned how to put people in the air. But we didn't have to do that anymore because we decided we could do this through policy. We could do this through things we know about, like redlining and various other policies which are in effect today. Right? But you can't understand, and I will give you a good example of not understanding unless you understand black history. Our own governor, and I know some of us who are elected don't want to use our governor to prove this point, but our governor about 2 weeks ago was in a paper quoted as saying that these people, meaning largely black and brown folks, should choose to live in better areas. Choose to live in better areas, which means that there's a lack of understanding of the historical context that puts those people in the areas they're in. And let's talk about historical context for being in the areas where black people have lived. Because sometimes we actually know some things, but again, miss part of the context. So we know that black people lived in the South, like my family that lived in Virginia and the Carolinas, and we know that they made their way to the North. But the way we talk about it, because we don't educate about the history of black people in this country, is we talk about it as if they just left seeking a new opportunity. We don't talk about the things that actually pushed them to leave, made them have to make the choice, as Isabel Wilkerson would tell you if you read her book, The Warmth of Other Suns, made them have to leave to go to those places and give up all of the safety and all that they knew. And this is why the history is important. And we're fighting today in the state of Connecticut on some very important things. I wear this shirt today not just because it's cold and I want to be warm. I wear this shirt because there's a fight about the regional institutions, Southern, Central, Eastern, and Western, going on right now, where they need funding. They don't just need the funding because it's the normal battle that we always have. They need the funding because they cannot do what they need to do for the populations they currently have. And given that we're talking about Black History Month, I'll give you a clue as to what the population looks like, right? And at the point where the population becomes that much more black and brown, where we can say these are minority serving institutions, to the point where some of them are minority majority institutions, guess what we are doing? We are defunding them. And we are defunding them and then saying, well, they should manage themselves better. Let me make sure you understand this before I leave. Not only do they need what needed to be there already, but they need more, because the populations they are serving have to deal with all of that history and all of the ways that they now show up without everything that they need. Not because there's something wrong with them, but because through choices we've made in policy, we've created a context in which they show up in that way. And since we talked about Ronald Reagan, I'll bring up Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater, in his kind of confessional, talked about there was a point at which we were saying nigger. And then we started saying other things. And then we got so abstract that we were talking about taxes and cutting and smaller government, right? You understand how this works? Well, right now, when we talk about those places where opportunity exists, those institutions that are actually affordable, or should be, those institutions where the people who never could get can get, we say guardrails. Not very different than tax cuts. We say, well, we have to worry about bondholders over people, right? Think about the connections that you don't see if you don't understand the long history that brings us to this moment. And so for me, Black history is always important, because there's nothing that I see in this country that is disconnected from that history. I wouldn't be here without the particular history that we have. I grew up in the Bronx in a housing project. And the story of a person like me normally doesn't land me in the state of Connecticut with that bio, except that Black people have a very particular history here of figuring out ways to overcome and innovating through all of the things that you know about black people. That's why we have jazz music that develops the way that it does, right? It's not the way that music had functioned before. In my era, I'm born in 1974, in my era, we had the creation of hip-hop music. And so I'm a child in the South Bronx who is very much connected to hip-hop and the ethos of hip-hop. And what is that? It takes what was there before and it changes it. I used to give a speech at the high schools for graduation, and I would talk about you can't be a child of the hip-hop era and stuck where you are. Because what I know about the music and culture that I grew up in is that we would do something different than my mother would do. My mother, during her time, they would listen to music, it would go off the radio and go away. During my time, music would come on the radio, it might go away, but then somebody would get an idea. You know what? I could put a different track under it, and the music would come back as a wholly new thing. Or somebody would say, I like the way the track is, but if only someone said this on that track. So I would come on this track and put a new rhyme or sing a new part of the song, and it would come back as a wholly new thing, a wholly different thing, changing what had happened and not settling for it as it is. I adopted that into my life. And so when I got here, I didn't like what I saw. And because of our history that brought us to that moment in the South Bronx where people were fighting and figured out a new way of fighting without killing each other, which is what black people have always figured out how to do, by the way, because of that moment that comes up out of the history, the way that I see life operates in a very particular way. And when we don't teach the history, none of it makes sense. It doesn't make sense that I come from where I came from and stand here. It doesn't make sense that they're talking about guardrails instead of people. None of it makes sense. So to me, black history should always be taught. But not Martin Luther King stood on the steps and talked about his dream. Because if you know the speech, you know that that dream was the latter part of the speech, but you forget about the whole beginning of the speech. And the beginning of that speech is important because you might actually think, oh, this conversation about reparations actually makes sense if you actually understood Martin Luther King, right? And you might actually understand why Martin Luther King was not the person that Ronald Reagan talked about in his speech, if you understood what he was saying. And why, when Ronald Reagan opposed the holiday, he finally came around when they figured out how to talk about Martin Luther King in such ways to sanitize him. Because the Martin Luther King that died in 1968 died right after he gave a speech in which he called out Wonder Bread, Seal Test, and other companies by name. Nobody remembers this, right? We just remember the dream. He died a hated man. And so that context is important because today we are still using that same sanitized version of Martin Luther King to say this is how you should speak if you want to help move people forward. Except that Martin Luther King didn't speak the way that people say he spoke. He was considered dangerous and hated and all of those things. And so I'll just end with this. Black History Month is not, to me, a month just to celebrate. It's a month to remember and contextualize the history of all of America.